Welcome back to Inside the Story. Today we're going to tell you about a historical event that greatly influenced the war in the Pacific during the Second World War. A naval battle that represented a significant chapter and at the same time perhaps one of the most tragic examples of the early phase of that theater of war. A theater of war that began on December 7, 1941, with the treacherous attack by the Japanese fleet on Pearl Harbor. And it continued until the summer of 1945 with the explosion of the two atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and finally the unconditional surrender of Japan. Today we're talking about a theater of war that has long been underestimated by historians, at least by the ones we're used to. We're talking about an episode whose anniversary falls today, the 84th anniversary, which combines a sense of duty, supposed heroism, and inferiority in both resources and manpower, in the desperate attempt to assert the existence and sovereignty of a theoretically defeated state, but still combative. Today we talk about the Battle of the Java Sea and about a man, Commander Karel Durman, an officer placed in command of an extremely heterogeneous group and who led almost fanatically a battle, a confrontation impossible to win. The Battle of the Java Sea, fought on February 27, 1942, is one of the first major naval battles in the Pacific. A theater of war that began, as we said, on December 7, 1941, and which in its early stages saw enormous Japanese superiority. A superiority dictated by several factors. Let's try to identify them. When the Japanese Empire decides to go on the offensive, it does so after clearly defining its strategic objectives. First of all, to secure control of the natural resources that were necessary to continue, above all, the conflict in China, which had begun years earlier. It had become a sort of muddy swamp for the Imperial Army. And then, of course, to continue the war that had just begun against the old European powers. First and foremost, Great Britain, but also the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and against the United States. These resources were called oil, rubber, rare materials, resources that the Dutch East Indies, present-day Indonesia, are rich in, precisely in the Dutch East Indies. Within the Asian chessboard, you could find, and you can still find today, great resources to exploit. And the Japanese Empire had set its sights on those resources. The rapid fall of Singapore in February 1942, preceded by the fall of Hong Kong, the conquest of the last concessions in Shanghai, and the land attacks on Burma and Malaysia, confirmed a Japanese advance that was essentially unstoppable, even with regard to the Philippines. The puppet state at the time of the United States, which had gone from being a bulwark of the southern Pacific area to becoming a deadly trap for its defenders. In this context, the Nihonkai gun, the Imperial Japanese Navy, with its well-established offensive doctrine and highly trained crews, both in daytime and nighttime conditions, in addition to the use of new technologies, it had set as its top priority any Allied naval force capable of interfering with its operations, including amphibious landings. The Dutch East Indies were a target, it was said. But who could actually defend this archipelago so rich in resources? The first to want to defend it, obviously, were the Netherlands. The Netherlands had entered the Second World War in late spring of 1940 because they were invaded, despite their declaration of neutrality, by Nazi Germany. The Netherlands had eventually decided to side with the Allies. The royal government had moved to London in exile. Most of the Dutch Navy, the Koninklijke Marine, had followed the royal court. Only ships still on the slipways, under construction or being fitted out, and a few old vessels had been left behind. But the real problem of the Netherlands was political in nature. It was a problem rooted in the need to be recognized as a fighting force, and not just as a government in exile. For this reason, the Dutch royal court, even though it was hosted in London, had insisted on having an active role in the war events. But the Dutch army had almost collapsed during the German offensive, and the only fighting force with any real strength was the Navy. The Navy was stationed in various colonial ports, Curaçao, Suriname, and of course the Dutch East Indies. But what was this Navy made up of? Partly old coastal battleships, practically useless, only suitable to be used as floating batteries for port defense. Then a group of cruisers, but not all of them were of the latest design. In fact, the latest cruisers, those of the Trump class, had to take refuge in England, still incomplete, so much so that the English themselves would actually take care of fitting the armaments on these new ships. The ship that was supposed to be the flagship of the Dutch Navy, the cruiser De Zeven Provinciën, had remained in the homeland, captured on the slipways by the Germans, who had even tried to rebuild it. For the rest, there remained a mixed fleet, ships of old design, a few better ships in better condition, but not enough to defend an entire archipelago. For the Netherlands, maintaining the colonies had in any case become a test of state continuity, and in this sense, the Koninklijk Marine found itself having to take on a task disproportionate to the means available, which were far too few. The officers were experienced, but under their command there were crews who were not ready, not used to modern warfare, and ships that were old, outdated, or never fully tested. A situation with low chances of success and a confrontation against a navy like the Japanese one, much more battle-hardened, much better trained and determined to conquer. However, the Dutch officer corps relied on exceptional men. One of them was Karel Durman. Born in Utrecht on April 23, 1889, he started his career at a very young age. He was trained during a period of profound technological transformation in the navies, which had changed rapidly from the last steam-powered ships to the new ships with boilers, first coal-fired and then oil-fired, and to the new artillery. Durman had developed a concept of command strongly based on a sense of duty and moral responsibility toward the men entrusted to his leadership. In the period between the two world wars, the first of which saw the Netherlands truly remain neutral, Durman served precisely in the Dutch East Indies. He had acquired a deep knowledge of the local operating conditions. His experience in the field of naval aviation, which was the great innovation of the post-war period, had made him aware of the importance of the air factor. Although in 1942 the Royal Dutch Air Force had been reduced to a minimum, and the Royal Dutch Navy could not even count on an escort carrier. Promoted to Rear Admiral in 1939, Durman had taken command of the Dutch naval forces in the East Indies, and later he was entrusted with the combined striking force of a new command, the American, British, Dutch, Australian, American, British, Dutch, Australian Command. This new coordination point, this new Allied Joint Command, was simply an attempt, not even a very successful one, to try to coordinate what was left of the British Royal Navy with the Australian and Dutch forces, and minimal help from the United States Navy to counter the rising Japanese tide. The Allied force under the command of Durman was made up of ships from all these countries. United States ship Houston, a heavy cruiser, His Majesty's ship Exeter, another British heavy cruiser, 2 Dutch cruisers, the De Ruyter, the flagship, and the Java, an obsolete ship that would have been destined for scrapping if the war hadn't broken out. And finally, the Her Majesty's Australian ship Perth, an Australian cruiser but built in England, plus a squadron of 9 destroyers from the 4 navies. This extremely heterogeneous unit represented a serious operational limitation, made worse by several factors, in addition to the obsolescence of several ships, like the Java, for example, by the shortage of ammunition, the lack of joint training, and in some cases, like the Houston, by problems on board. The Houston joined the striking force after having basically lost one of its 3 main 203 mm gun turrets. A Japanese air attack a few days earlier had put the aft turret out of action, thus reducing the ship's offensive capability by a third. The Japanese forces, on the other hand, included modern heavy cruisers and destroyers armed with the new long-lance torpedoes, which were superior in range and power to any equivalent Allied weapon. The Japanese doctrine favored preemptive torpedo attacks, night combat, and aggressive maneuvers, all elements that, as we will see, would prove decisive in the battle. On February 27, 1942, Durman's forces set sail from Surabaya. Their objective was to intercept the Japanese invasion convoy. The Allied command knows that Japan is targeting the main island of the archipelago, the island of Java, and from there plans to move on to conquer the other islands. And the Allied command also knows that the Japanese have prepared a massive landing force accompanied by a large and well-armed fleet. Contact between the two forces occurs at 4 p.m. north of the island of Madura, but from the very beginning of the clash, serious problems of coordination and communication among the Allied units emerge. The Exeter, which had already taken part more than 2 years earlier in the victorious hunt for the Graf Spee, is severely damaged and is forced to leave the line to retreat, trying to get to safety. The loss of one of the two heavy cruisers further reduces the fighting strength. The Allies' attempts to attack with the destroyers fail, while the Japanese, maneuvering with extreme speed and determination, manage to maintain control of the initiative. Thanks to the aforementioned technical and technological superiority, when night falls, the battle becomes dramatic. The two Dutch cruisers, De Ruyter and Java, start taking the first hits. They are torpedoes, the Japanese long lance that find their targets. Durman sends his last message, "Follow me," but no one follows him. The De Ruyter, his ship, is hit repeatedly and blows up, sinking. With the destruction of the De Ruyter, Karel Durman also dies, refusing until the very end to abandon his command. The battle is lost, and above all, it marks the definitive destruction of the Allied naval force in the East Indies and the now imminent loss of the Dutch colony. If we have to evaluate Durman's command in this action, it must be said that more than one controversy emerges. If some of the tactical criticisms made against him posthumously seem justified, the most recent historiography tends to place his decisions in the context of a desperate strategic situation, devoid of realistic alternatives. Durman, on this occasion, operates within a multinational structure that is inefficient, with inferior resources and extremely rigid political directives from which he cannot escape. The moral factor, the need to maintain not only the territory but also an appearance of military importance by the Netherlands, plays a decisive role in the matter. Durman's decision to continue fighting reflects a concept of command in which personal example, that of the high-ranking officer, and sacrifice take on primary importance, even at the cost of the destruction of the force entrusted to him. The Battle of the Java Sea paves the way for the Japanese occupation of the island of Java. It is the dissolution of the American, British, Dutch, Australian command, which is disbanded once it is confirmed that the forces no longer exist. The ships that survived the Battle of the Java Sea are sunk one after another in the following days as they try to reach ports for repairs, or as soon as they arrive at their destination, struck by Japanese aircraft. On the political level, the disastrous battle marks the beginning of the end of Dutch colonial rule in Indonesia, foreshadowing the decolonization processes that would take place after the war. From a strictly military point of view, the battle provides fundamental lessons about the importance of inter-allied coordination, something that had never been seen before, and that from that moment on would need to be refined. Not only that, excellent insights are gained regarding air superiority and doctrinal adaptation. All this information, all these notions would be embraced and assimilated by the Allies as the war went on. And in the end, with the need for full and absolute control, they would lead the Allies to overturn the outcome of the conflict. The Battle of the Java Sea cannot be seen solely as a military defeat, but rather as an event of profound historical significance. It highlighted the crisis of European naval power in Asia and the need to radically rethink the ways of conducting warfare at sea. The figure of Karel Durman emerges as that of a tragic commander, a symbol of a military world in transition, unable to adapt quickly enough to a new strategic reality, but still deeply tied to the values of honor and self. Today we look back at the figure of Karel Durman, but we look not only at his actual figure, but also at the mythologizing that has been carried out by the Dutch Royal Navy, which, among other things, has dedicated monuments to him and even named ships after him. Well, all this leads us to debunk a myth and to reflect on the need to identify positive symbols. In a period marked by military defeat and occupations, Karel Durman found himself in a situation where he had to coordinate ships that came from different nations accustomed to very different combat tactics from one another. Sometimes he even had to face, as a commander in the field, at sea, superior officers who were more capable than himself. He bore two responsibilities, the military one, but also the political one. In fact, it was an excessive challenge both for his shoulders as a man and as an officer, and for the forces at his disposal. And so, in concluding this video, it's right to ask, was the sacrifice of Karel Durman, his men, and the other allies truly useful to the Dutch cause? Or was it possible to adopt another strategy? Was it really necessary to send an entire fleet to the slaughter, thinking that this would delay the inevitable, the arrival of the Japanese troops? These may be redundant questions, but they need to be asked in historical analysis. Today, as we remember the sacrifice of Karel Durman in vain, we must ask ourselves these questions, also because they serve as a lesson, both for military strategists and for politicians, who very often, in their blindness, send officers and soldiers or sailors to die without considering the real consequences of their decisions.